Things looked different when you saw them through the lens of a movie camera. The projector whirred, and its bright light illuminated the scene. It first focused on a punch glass that had fallen to the ground and shattered into tiny shards. The crystal glass reflected the light from the camera, and the neon green of the drugs seemed to react to the light and began to glow. The camera then focused on the fat leg next to the glass. The camera slowly went up the leg to the fat body it was attached to until it rested on the bulging, terrified eyes of Aunt Marge. She was tied to her chair with rope. A homemade bomb was secured inside her mouth. Around her neck was Ripper's collar. He had wanted her to know that her hideous dog was dead, even though technically he wasn't responsible for it. Harry walked to Uncle Vernon next, who was restrained and gagged the same way. Dudley, as the birthday boy, had the honor of being hog-tied in the middle of the patio. A birthday boy hat was on top of his head. His eyes practically disappeared into his fat cheeks as they overflowed with tears. Snot dribbled from his nose. He tried to scream, but like the others had explosive jams into his mouth. The camera turned to Aunt Petunia, whose eyes were so wide in horror that they eclipsed the rest of her face. Unlike the others, she did not cry or try to scream. She was too afraid to move. She even tried not to breathe too hard. Though Aunt Petunia was gagged with explosives and restrained in her chair like the others, her setup was slightly different. Harry supposed that in the end he resented her the most, and that is why he set things up the way he did. The trigger for Dudley's explosives were under her left palm, and the trigger for her husband's explosives were under her right palm. Aunt Marge's explosives were tied to Uncle Vernon, so she would go off a few seconds later. Aunt Petunia's explosives, like Mrs. Figg's, were set up to be manually triggered. Harry turned the camera to the unconscious figure of Mrs. Figg. Drool was coming down the side of her chin. She had been an unwelcome guest, but Harry decided that she would start things off. Harry scraped a long match and held it up, recording the expression of the family as this threat gave them a glimpse of their lives coming to an end. Aunt Marge, Uncle Vernon, and Dudley began to scream louder, though the bomb muffled most of it. Aunt Petunia's lower stomach began to move as she hyperventilated and trembled with fear. Harry lit the wick of Mrs. Figg's explosives, then quickly backed up. The flame traveled up, and then suddenly there was a deafening bang. The camera caught this blood splattering the nearby wall in an artistic arc. Harry moved closer to film the remains of what was left of Mrs. Figg's face. Behind him, the screams of the others became louder and even more panicked. Even Aunt Petunia was trying to scream loud enough to rouse the neighbors. Though they were loud enough to be heard by the neighbors, who were indeed annoyed by the silence being shattered by the explosion, the Dursleys' past behavior guaranteed that no one was going to come to help them or even complain. It was well known that it was Dudley's birthday, and the Dursleys in the past had always demanded lenience in honor of that occasion. The neighbors were also accustomed to hearing screams from Dudley's often violent games and TV programs, so the sounds really were not that out of the ordinary, even if the event itself was. Harry turned to Aunt Petunia with an evil grin. In the background, standing by the tree, was Mr. Boogie, silently watching the scene. Harry pulled out a butane torch from his free hand and activated it. He started to burn the arm that held the trigger to Dudley's explosives. Aunt Petunia screeched. Her face turned bright red. She tried to resist clenching her hand, which would activate the trigger, but in the end the pain forced her to. The explosives didn't totally muffle the torture howl that came from both Dursley parents as they watched their son's head explode. Rockets shot up into the sky as if celebrating and singing to the world, "Pop, pop, the bully is dead, the bully is dead, all rejoice because the bully is dead." Tears dripped from Aunt Petunia's face. Harry then started burning her other arm, and again it was only a matter of time before her hands activated the trigger for her husband's explosives, which in turn triggered Aunt Marge's explosives. The noise that heralded these two deaths was deafening. Harry's eyes were nearly dazzled by the light of the fireworks, which were closer to the ground and danced around the bodies. Harry faced his aunt one last time. She stared at him in defeat through blurred vision. "Why did you take me in if you didn't want me?" Harry asked her hoarsely. Whether it was from emotion or the smoke, his throat felt like it had a lump in it. She couldn't reply, of course. She just shook her head. Harry reached over and lit the wick to her explosives. She closed her eyes, 2 tears trickling down the opposite sides of her cheeks simultaneously before the explosives went off and destroyed her face. Smoke hung in the air as thick as the silence that followed the cacophony of death. Harry paused the camera to collect some of the gore for the last finishing touch. When he had enough, he drew Bagul's symbol on the ground, constructing it much like he used to do with macaroni pictures in class, but he wasn't using macaroni this time. Looking down at his work with satisfaction, he turned the camera on once again to film it. Exhaustion was starting to catch up with Harry, but there was still some things left to do. In addition to the film, Harry had to draw a stick figure still life of the scene and label everyone. The projector was set up and was playing his film. He glanced up as he finished the drawing, admiring his work. He was certain he had made the best film yet. The film ended with Harry lifting his finger to his mouth and going, "Shh." Suddenly the image flickered and Harry saw the ghost kids gathered in what looked like an ancient temple. He could see the walls behind them were decorated with strange glyphs that looked like they had been done in blood. Harry stepped into the light of the projector, but his shadow did not block the image on the screen. The ghost kid smiled and he was being welcomed by his new brothers and sisters. Suddenly he felt himself being lifted up and carried. Bagul had appeared behind him. Harry rested his head against Mr. Boogie's shoulder, and suddenly his eyes felt like they had weights attached to him, and he could not keep them open anymore. Bagul's eyes glowed brightly, his mouth curving up in the slightest smile. The children skipped away as he approached the screen. As if it was an extension of the room, Bagul stepped into the film with the sleeping boy in his arms.